All right. Thank you, Courtney. Hello, everybody. See how hot this mic is. Yes, thanks for coming out on a chilly evening. Tonight's presentation is one of a continuing series of public events made possible by a grant from the Mass Cultural Council. I'm grateful to them and grateful to the Concord Free Library also for their permission to use some of the images that I'll be using tonight here. The Thoreau Society has 1,200 members in 30 nations around the world, in all 50 states, including the Penobscot Nation in Maine. The Thoreau Society is the oldest organization dedicated to an American author and exists to stimulate interest in and foster education about Thoreau's life, works, legacy, and his place in his world and in ours, challenging all of us to live a deliberate, considered life. Samples of our publications and our email list are back there on that table. You can grab any of those old, couple-year-old, what we call bulletins, Thoreau Society bulletins. We also have a yearly book publication we put out called The Concord Saunterer. We have a couple copies of that as well. If you'd like to be kept in touch about events like this, feel free to join our email list back there as well. Tonight, I'd like to speak about how misunderstood Henry Thoreau was in his own time, and perhaps is even more so today. How these misunderstandings grew out of projection and sometimes intellectual laziness. As a boy and throughout his adult life, Thoreau was standoffish, serious, and observant. He and his motivations, or seeming lack thereof, brought him constant criticism. Takedowns, if you will, of Henry began at an early age where he was nicknamed the Judge by kids his own age who found him aloof, disengaged. And the takedowns of Henry have continued to present day, long after his death in 1862. To begin, here's Nathaniel Hawthorne from the Old Manse in 1842. Henry Thoreau's been invited over for dinner in September of that year. Hawthorne has just moved in with his new bride, Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, in July. And he's meeting Mr. Thoreau for the first time. Mr. Thoreau dined with us yesterday. He is a singular character, a young man with much of wild, original nature still remaining in him. And so far as he is sophisticated, it is in a way and method of his own. He is ugly as sin, long-nosed, queer-mouthed, and with uncouth and rustic, though courteous manners, corresponding very well with such an exterior. But his ugliness is of an honest and agreeable fashion, and becomes him much better than beauty. He was educated, I believe, at Cambridge, Harvard, and formerly kept school in this town. But for 2 or 3 years back, he has repudiated all regular modes of getting a living, and seems inclined to lead a sort of Indian life among civilized men. And Indian life, I mean, as respects the absence of any systematic effort for a livelihood. He has been for some time an inmate of Mr. Emerson's family. In requital, he labors in the garden and performs such other offices as may suit him, being entertained by Mr. Emerson for the sake of what true manhood there is in him. Mr. Thoreau is a keen and delicate observer of nature, a genuine observer, which I suspect is almost as rare a character as even an original poet. And nature, in return for his love, seems to adopt him as her special child and shows him secrets which few others are allowed to witness. He is familiar with beast, fish, fowl, and reptile, and has strange stories to tell of adventures and friendly passages with these lower brothers of mortality. Herb and flower likewise, wherever they grow, whether in garden or wildwood, are his familiar friends. He is also on intimate terms with the clouds and can tell the portents of storms. It is a characteristic trait that he has a great regard for the memory of the Indian tribes, whose wild life would have suited him so well. And strange to say, he seldom walks over a plowed field without picking up an arrowhead, a spearhead, or other relic of the red man, as if their spirits willed him to be the inheritor of their simple wealth. Henry might well have countered this with one of his more popular quotes.
Excuse me, I don't see that as a takedown.
Well, it's damning with faint praise, maybe. Not damning. It's a little edgy, I would say. Uncouth, and his ugliness.
Yeah, but then he goes on and compliments him.
Yeah. He finds him to be an interesting character. He's completely unlike the very handsome and very introverted Hawthorne, who is a completely different animal than Henry. I think, and Hawthorne's trying to get a feel for who Henry is. If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. Henry was and continues to be quite misunderstood, enigmatic, hard to pin down, even with his 2 million word journal transcribed and available to us to pore over. There are lots of differing opinions of who Henry was and how Henry was. For example, he's been called eccentric, a hermit, a Luddite, someone who eschews technology. Many people say Henry was a pacifist. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Humorless on some levels. And what really stings is this hypocrite that Henry didn't do what he set out to do. And we're going to talk about this. This is one of these key takedowns that continue on against Henry. The oversimplification of and projections on Henry Thoreau are more widespread today than in his own lifetime. And a kind of meme is now floating out there that diminishes almost to a point of canceling one of America's most profound and influential writers. Here's the oversimplification that Henry was just playing at Survivor at Walden. Okay. Thoreau honed his skills of self-sufficiency like a contestant on Survivor. This is a oversimplification of what Henry was doing. We'll get into this a little bit further as I go further here. In the New Yorker in 2015, Thoreau did not live as he described, and no ethical principle is emptier than one that does not apply to its author. In the Boston Globe this past summer, his whole experiment was a little contrived. Thoreau is the author we love to hate. This is fascinating. Where does this come from? Let's start with where Henry came from. Henry was born July 12, 1817 on Virginia Road in Concord. He was christened David Henry Thoreau, but started going by Henry in his teens. Thoreau Society and Thoreau Farm Trust offices are located here, as well as Gaining Ground Organic Farm, which supplies local food pantries and area meals programs with fresh produce. You can tour Thoreau Farm May through October on Saturdays and Sundays. If you're interested in coming by and seeing the birth room, the room where Henry was born. As I mentioned earlier, Henry was a quiet and observant child, not as outgoing as his older by 5 years sister, Helen, or his older by 3 years brother, John. 2 years after Henry, his younger sister, Sophia, was born. Sophia would eventually be Henry's literary executor after his death. Three of the best known images of Henry: a crayon drawing from 1854. 1856 is a Worcester daguerreotype he had done in Worcester, and in New Bedford, he had that photo taken less than a year before his death due to tuberculosis in 1862. His father, John Thoreau, was a shopkeeper in Concord Center, as well as for a time in Chelmsford. Thoreau's mother, Cynthia, ran their home as a boarding house. Cynthia had a brother, Charles, who lucked upon a vein of graphite called plumbago up in New Hampshire. And after securing and mining it, he collaborated with John Thoreau Sr. in a pencil making business. Henry himself would be instrumental in helping his father innovate the engineering around pencil making by adding and baking clay with the graphite for smoothness, and in developing a stepped machine for collecting the finest dust from the graphite grinding process. In the early 1830s, typesetter William Lloyd Garrison began publishing The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper out of Boston. Garrison's weekly had a huge influence on Henry's mother, sisters, and aunts. It also influenced the nascent women's movement and grew out of the female anti-slavery societies, which spread from Boston to Concord to Worcester to Western New York and elsewhere. Garrison supported the total emancipation of all enslaved individuals without compensation to their owners. This, of course, was an economically disruptive, controversial notion, and through his promotion of public lectures by Frederick Douglass, Garrison attempted to bring slavery to an end through moral suasion, he called it, to basically guilt Americans into ending slavery by publishing the atrocities that were reported from around the country happening to enslaved individuals. If you note, there's a slogan in the upper right-hand corner there that says, "No union with slaveholders." We have this sentiment here in New England, breaking from the southern states in the 1830s, long before the Civil War. The Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society, which formed in 1837, was one of the biggest supporters of Garrison, and at first a fringe and somewhat marginalized group, but 7 years later, it would become the central fire of the abolitionist and Underground Railroad town that Concord would become. Henry grew up immersed in a politically and socially conscious household. He attended Harvard between 1833 and 37. He was ranked in the middle of his class of about 40 and was chosen to address his graduating class on a topic of his choice. He chose the commercial spirit of modern times in 1837. And this was timely because America was in the throes of its first major economic crisis in 1837. There was a run on American banks due to speculative lending, a drop in cotton prices, and too much commercial paper in circulation. This led to the closure of 40% of America's banks and worldwide deflation and high unemployment from 1837 to 1844. Before those assembled at Harvard, Henry asserted that commerce destroys moral freedom. But freedom must come first, however, because freedom generates commerce, not the other way around. As Laura Dasso-Walls wrote in her 2017 biography, Thoreau, A Life, an excellent biography, by the way, Henry emphasized, quote, "By tying us to material goods, commerce does not free us, but enslaves us, turns us into brutes. To be human is to cast off these material desires and walk forth freely into paradise." Right there, Thoreau laid the foundations for Walden, unquote. Walls also goes on to note Henry's suggested alternative to our standard work week. Quote, "The seventh day should be man's day of toil, wherein to earn his living by the sweat of his brow, and the other six, his Sabbath of the affections and the soul, in which to range this widespread garden and drink in the soft influences and sublime revelations of nature." How does that sound? Work hard, real hard 1 day a week. You've got enough to get through 6 more days to do it again. I like that idea. After graduation, Henry spent some well-earned downtime with classmate Charles Stearns Wheeler at Sandy Pond, also known as Flint's Pond in Lincoln. The homemade cabin they stayed in would foreshadow Henry's stay at Walden 8 years later. To Henry's good fortune, in 1837, he landed a teaching job amidst this economic crisis for the town of Concord. He was going to be paid $500 a year to teach 90 students of all varying ages. And this would take place on the first floor of the Masonic Hall, which is still here in the town center. A couple of weeks into Thoreau's new position as a teacher, Deacon Nehemiah Ball came in to observe his new teacher, and he commented, "Henry, you're doing a fine job, but I'm noting that you are not hitting the children. You need to use the fair rule and hit the children on the open hand to discipline them, and it's a key part of elementary school education." Henry said, "I have my own ways of disciplining these children. I do not need to use the fair rule." He said, "Oh, no. You need to use the fair rule. It's a part of this whole position you're in." And he said, "In fact, I need you to grab 2 students right now and demonstrate for me how to use the ferrule." So he grabs a boy and a girl who've done nothing wrong whatsoever, smacks them both on the hand into tears. Henry hands the keys to him and says, "I'm done." 2 weeks into his teaching career, in the midst of a financial panic, after his parents had sacrificed with his whole family sacrificed to get him through Harvard, he's back at home making pencils with his father. And but this is Henry, unequivocal when it comes to principle, unwavering. So his first job out of college lasted just 2 weeks. As Henry returned home into pencil making with his father, He struck up a friendship with Lucy Jackson Brown, who was a boarder in his family's home, who happened to be the sister-in-law of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who lived across town. When Lucy Jackson introduced Thoreau to her brother-in-law, Emerson was struck by the spirited intellect of his new friend and his wry observations and asked, "What are you doing? Do you keep a journal?" Henry began a journal which would eventually run to over 2 million words. Emerson noted in his journal, "My good Henry Thoreau made else this solitary afternoon sunny with his simplicity and clear perception. Everything that boy says makes merry with society, though nothing could be graver than his meaning." Emerson told more than one visitor to Concord that Thoreau was the man of Concord. We could not do without him. Emerson, former minister, poet, and lecturer, published the book Nature the year before. Henry had already read it, had taken it out of the Harvard Library twice in his senior year. Emerson opened his library and home to Henry and became a close friend and mentor. Emerson's Nature is known as the cornerstone text to American transcendentalist thought. And let's take a sidebar for a second to talk about, try and get at least a general definition of transcendentalism. A 19th century movement of writers and philosophers in New England who were loosely bound together by adherence to an idealistic system of thought based on a belief in the essential unity of all creation, the innate goodness of humanity, and the supremacy of insight over logic and experience for the revelation of the deepest truths. German transcendentalism, especially as it was refracted by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas Carlyle in England, Platonism, Neoplatonism, the Indian and Chinese scriptures were all sources to which the New England transcendentalists turned in their search for a liberating philosophy. Transcendentalism puts the emphasis on the human spirit realizing truth, justice, and beauty first through the intuitive and reasoned mind, then positing facts. Thoreau writes of building castles in the air and then putting foundations under them. And as Ralph Waldo Emerson would say in 1842, transcendentalism is idealism in 1842. And when asked which religious tradition would be closest to transcendentalism, Emerson said Quakerism, interestingly. And although many call Emerson's American transcendentalism its first philosophy, it's by no means uniquely American. It is, like America itself, derived from a melting pot of spiritual philosophies from over the centuries and around the globe. What Japanese Buddhists call Satori, an inner intuitive experience of enlightenment said to be unexplainable, indescribable, comparing to the experience undergone by Buddha when he sat under the Bo tree. It's analogous to the conversion experience or spiritual rebirth of other religious traditions that constitutes a complete reordering of the individual in relation to the universe. Emerson had his own Satori experience that he relates in nature, and he calls this his transparent eyeball moment. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of any special good fortune, I've enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. Emerson felt he lost himself completely. I became a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. This is part of what makes Nature so controversial for a former minister to be publishing in 1836. Thoreau, too, will eventually write about his own moments of Satori at Walden Pond. Now, Henry was 20 years old at this point and very impressionable. It would take some time for him to grow from under the shadow of his mentor and find his own voice. And people in Concord began noticing that Henry was walking and talking very much like Waldo Emerson. Henry's mother noted, however, "Isn't it charming how Mr. Emerson is so much like my Henry?" The poet, editor, and diplomat James Russell Lowell noted this in his own early critique of Henry. "There comes Thoreau, for instance, to see him's rare sport, tread in Emerson's tracks with legs painfully short. How he jumps, how he strains to get red in the face, to keep step with the mystagogue's natural pace. He follows as close as a stick to a rocket, his fingers exploring the prophet's each pocket. Fie for shame, brother Bard, with good fruit of your own, can't you let neighbor Emerson's orchards alone? Henry was actually taking care of Emerson's orchards. Emerson wasn't Henry's only mentor in Concord. The elder George P. Minot, who lived on a hill across from Emerson's house, was a bachelor farmer and hunter, a man who never belonged to a civic organization or a church, never voted, never traveled, was a living model of self-reliance and accrued natural wisdom. He shared a house with his sister Mary, who made her living as a seamstress. George had lived his life working deliberately and inspired Henry to do the same. When Henry asked George's sister Mary to create a coat for him with specific features, she said to him, "Well, they don't wear it that way anymore, Henry." Henry was beside himself, pondering who exactly they might be. "Well, they do now," he retorted. Henry writes that George Minot is perhaps the most poetical farmer I know, who most realizes to me the poetry of the farm's life. He does nothing with haste and drudgery, but as if he loved it. He makes the most of his labor and takes infinite satisfaction in every part of it. He's not looking forward to the sale of his crops or any pecuniary profit, but he is paid by the constant satisfaction which his labor yields him. He has not too much land to trouble him, too much work to do, no hired man or boy, but simply to amuse himself and live. He cares not so much to raise a large crop as to do his work well. This late 19th century painting by Enoch Wood brings to mind what it may have looked like as Henry visited regularly with George Minot and took in all he could from George's life story. We have probably near 100 entries in Thoreau's journal, which start with "Minot says," and the old man would relate stories from his whole life and keep Henry wrapped. All right. By 1838 and 39, Henry and his brother John not only opened a preparatory school together, they built a boat together, like this small one here. In 1839, they spent 2 weeks sailing up the Concord and Merrimack rivers to New Hampshire and back. Henry took copious notes that would eventually be condensed into his A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, written while at Walden Pond between 1845 and 47, published 10 years after the trip itself in 1849. In 1839, the Thoreau house received summer boarders, friends from south of Boston. 22-year-old Henry found himself quite taken with 11-year-old Edmund Sewell and the, quote, virtue which he is, unquote, and would serve as his teacher as well as his summer companion, hiking, swimming, fishing, shooting, boating. A stanza of the poet's sympathy that Henry wrote for Edmund reads, "So I was taken unawares by this. I quite forgot my homage to confess. Yet now am forced to know, though hard it is, I might have loved him had I loved him less." Weeks later came the arrival of Edmund's older sister, Ellen, who immediately got the attention of both John and Henry. The two brothers each courted Ellen on chaperoned excursions. Proposals of marriage from both John and Henry were eventually rejected, however. Ellen's conservative minister father refused to consider either of the transcendentalist Thoreau brothers as suitable suitors. In Thoreau, A Life, Laura Dasso-Walls writes that in 1839, Henry Thoreau fell in love twice. In January 1842, Henry's brother John cut himself while sharpening his shaving razor, and in a matter of days was convulsing in the throes of tetanus, or lockjaw, as it was known. Henry was absolutely shattered as his older brother died a brutal death in his arms, January 11th. John was 27 years old. Henry, exhibiting psychosomatic symptoms of his own, was bedridden for most of the next month, unable to separate his brother's suffering from that of his own. 16 days later, Ralph Waldo Emerson and his wife Lydia Emerson lost their firstborn son to scarlet fever. Young Waldo was only 5 years old. a chilling and dreadful winter month in Concord. Henry is also credited as being the father of American environmentalism and conservation. John Muir, Aldo Leopold, Theodore Roosevelt, and David Brower of the Sierra Club all noted being inspired by Thoreau. And one of the earliest calls for the national parks can be found in Thoreau's journal. Each town should have a park, or rather, a primitive forest of 500 or 1,000 acres where a stick should never be cut for fuel, a common possession forever for instruction and recreation. If any owners of these tracts are about to leave the world without natural heirs, they will do wisely to abandon their possession to all. Here is where we get, and we are now the benefactors of state and national parks and land trusts as well. Many people are not aware, however, that Henry Thoreau and his friend Edward Hoare were responsible for one of the biggest wildfires in Concord's history. In April 1844, Henry and Edward, while out fishing, started a fire in a hollowed out tree stump on a breezy day. When it was all over, 300 acres had been burned as the wind blew it out of control. Henry, being characteristically contrarian, noted that the forest fires were perfectly natural and happened all the time, and that everywhere that hadn't been touched by the fire, everywhere that had been touched by the fire was now greener than the areas that hadn't burned. Henry was taunted, however, by his fellow townsmen who nicknamed him Woods Burner. Later that summer, we're talking 1844, Frederick Douglass was invited to speak at the First Parish Church by the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. When the church backed out of hosting at the last minute, the meeting was moved across the street to the town hall, or what we call the townhouse in Concord. The church even refused the use of its bell to announce the gathering, but Henry took it upon himself to ring the bell anyway. That bell is now on display on the front lawn of Concord's First Parish Church, with a little plaque telling you about that event in 1844. By spring of 1845, Henry was busy collecting materials and making plans to build his tiny house on Emerson's land near Walden Pond. He would stay on and off for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. His was an experiment with intention. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, and cut a broad swath and shave close and drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. So Henry is not backing into a corner. Henry is trying to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. Describing this 10 by 15 foot house that he eventually built. And he notes his 3 chairs, 1 for solitude, 2 for friendship, and 3 for society. Some misconceptions about Thoreau and his cabin site. 1, that Henry was alone out there at Walden. Walden was the marginalized side of Concord. It was the woodlot for people in town. And there are formerly enslaved people living, very marginalized. There's Irish railroad workers that lived in shanties along what is the brand new railroad from 1844 there. Henry is going to have a group of people help him put the roof up on his small house. So he is not alone. He's not trying to run away from society and tuck himself away. He very much has 1 foot on Main Street still and 1 foot here at the pond. Another misconception is that Henry was really in this deep woods and he was really kind of isolated. And when we talk about the Thoreau cabin site, there are way more woods around Walden Pond today than there were in 1845 when Henry settled on July 4th. As I said, it was the woodlot for the town, and had huge sections of being bare. Actually, in terms of, I was just thinking that Henry will also have a meeting at his cabin of the Female Anti-Slavery Society from Concord. That's 30 or 40 people. So Henry is not self-isolating and trying to be all alone. He's perfectly, Henry takes a trip to Maine while he's at Walden. So he's not locked in there playing survivor. Okay, so this is, there's just a lot of misconception. And there's an artist on the South Shore here, John Roman, who does these meticulous drawings based on historical data. And this is his take of what Walden looked like in 1845 when Henry builds his cabin. And where we're standing here, the new Fitchburg Railroad has just been laid a year earlier. And so Henry's got this train coming by multiple times a day. He's got his bean field up there, which he's working in, and it's wide open compared to, what we think of today when we go visit this site, and we think we're in this woods up there.
Can I ask a question? I have heard that he used to take his laundry home to his mother. Is that true?
There wasn't a man in 1845 who did his own laundry.
Do that. So he wasn't that far away.
Did Henry ever say he was going to do his own laundry? Did Henry ever say he wasn't going to eat pie at his mother's house or go to dinner on Sunday at Emerson's if he was invited? No. Everybody is projecting and saying he's supposed to be survivor. He's supposed to be relegated to sticks and grass and eating, bugs, and toughing it out. And why is he a hypocrite? There isn't one part of any of that Henry ever said, I resign myself and I'm going to escape society. This is an experiment. He's lamenting the death of his brother from the year before. He's got this material he wants to get together from his boat trip into a book. And he is also doing an experiment in economy, which is the first chapter of Walden, where he is really trying to boil down, what do we really need? What is essential to life? Warmth, a roof, some food, water, he's really trying to do this experiment at a time when the material world is overwhelming Concord. We're getting goods from Europe. The trains come through, things are getting faster. It used to be like, what time is it? Oh, it's got to be near 10. Now it's 10:07 because the train just came by. Okay, so now we're on the train time, and now life's getting faster and it's getting more precise. And people are, Henry is watching the mills open, north of Concord in Lawrence and Lowell, the West Concord mills. And so there's this machine that the individual's being sucked into, and you're living off the clock and the whistles, and this kind of thing. And Henry is looking at this and saying, can we still live a deliberate life and kind of keep that at arm's length? Because the more we bite off materially, the more we have to work sun up to sundown every day to keep the ball going. And so this is really what Henry is thinking about. He's thinking about spirit in the material world, and he's got the Bhagavad Gita, the holy Indian book, with him at Walden the whole time that he's there. And there's a lot going on there. He's meditative. He's a yogi in a way. Yoga is a union. He is meditating on the physical and the spiritual, Henry, while he's there. But he has to go get his shoes fixed. He goes to town to get his shoes fixed, And his mom made pies, he'd go home, and sometimes his mom brings cookies out to him, or his sisters come and visit, or what have you. And he just goes on the railroad tracks, and his folks' house is just down the road off the railroad tracks, so he can walk what he calls the cut and go home when he needs to. But there isn't one part of what Henry did here, which is this survivor thing. And everybody calls him out on it, especially today. I don't even think back then, people thought, they just scratched their head a little bit and said, okay, Henry's out by the pond. As I said, he traveled to Maine. He left his door open and came and found ashes from pipes that other men, hunters and things had come through and used his cabin. And, he came back and, and people had been in there. So that's the kind of thing Henry has going here. Is I think people oversimplify and really sort of narrow him down and hold him to this standard that he never declared he was trying to live to. Some of the humor, Henry's humor is a little snarky, word-based, sometimes classical in its references. You have to be kind of well read to know what he's talking about. But as I walked over the long causeway made for the railroad through the meadows, this is that cut that he walks to his family house to occasionally. I encountered many a blustering and nipping wind, for nowhere has it freer play. And when the frost had smitten me on one cheek, heathen as I was, I turned it to the other also. So here's our heathen referencing the book of Matthew. And this is the kind of stuff that Henry would reference. He talks about that the banks are in trouble. And he goes, well, the merchants and banks are suspending and failing all the country over, but not the sand banks over here, solid and warm. You may run on them as much as you please, even as the crickets do, and find their account in it. He writes, in these banks too, such as these, are my funds deposited. Funds of health and enjoyment, and I'll leave that up to you all to figure out what he's talking about there. So he's just going punning on the banks of Walden.
Yes, on this photo, this was a woodlot, right?
Yeah, the whole area was the woodlot for the
But
town.
there's not much wood.
No, it's pretty well, looking for a second growth. Yeah, yeah. So it's already been pretty well cut, and so it's on its way coming back. Emerson actually had his eye on the cliffs across the pond over there. He too wanted to actually build a cabin and never really came to fruition. Bronson Alcott put together a whimsical kind of rickety little thing on Emerson's property called Tumble Down Hall that tumbled down pretty quickly. But so Emerson had his eye actually on what was called Emerson Cliff across over there. Emerson had bought pieces of around Walden as he walked there daily.
And
Almost
is that looking towards Wachusett?
That's looking east from the railroad tracks. If you know Walden, on the west side, you see the
Oh, right.
the
It's the
railroad
railroad
comes by
tracks.
right over here. And Henry's really close. He's at sort of, if the visitor center is down there at the other end of the pond.
Oh, okay.
And he's kind of at the 1 o'clock, if the visitor center is at 6 o'clock, you're looking at this whole thing as a clock from down that way. He's kind of at that 1 o'clock position on there.
Does that hill have a name now? It's not Mount Misery.
No, I think that's further into Lincoln, Mount Misery. This would be Emerson Cliff. These are these drumlins that are just down the road from the visitor center and around that left side of Walden. He worked on writing about his 2 weeks. He worked on writing about his 2 weeks on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers with his late brother John, and condensed the time frame into a week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, as the title would become. And this had to have been a deeply painful and cathartic process for Henry. He's still mourning the loss of his brother a year before. Henry's voluminous notes also included the raw material for what would become Walden or Life in the Woods 9 years later. Henry also had his own Satori moments while at the pond, a couple of instances. Oh, that's the wrong button. Little AI little ad here, kind of interesting. Sometimes in a summer morning, having taken my accustomed bath, I sat in my sunny doorway from sunrise till noon, wrapped in a reverie amidst the pines and hickories and sumacs, in undisturbed solitude and stillness, while the birds sang around or flitted noiseless through the house, until by the sun falling in at my west window, or the noise of some traveler's wagon on the distant highway, I was reminded of the lapse of time. Sometimes when I had finished hoeing for the day, I joined myself. I love these 3 words. He's hoeing beans in his field for hours. And he says, when I was done, I joined myself. Where was he before he joined himself? This is that spiritual and physical, where you kind of lose yourself in time and place and circumstance. And he writes, it was no longer beans that I hoed, nor I that hoed beans. So the physical and spiritual canceling each other out. This also is a theme of the Bhagavad Gita, and something that Henry is deeply immersed at the pond. The AI here did a pretty good job, especially with Henry's face, but I think it took my hoeing as rowing. So AI has a little ways to go.
That's reassuring.
Thoreau's data collection was extensive and included a survey of the pond. Richard Premack from Boston University and Thoreau Society board member Kristen Case from the University of Maine at Farmington are at work with data collected by Henry over his 3-year stay at the pond. Spring is now 1 to 2 weeks earlier than it was in 1846. This is the kind of thing that Kristen and Richard work with. They're making sense of Henry's journal, and he took copious notes. In mapping the pond itself in winter, charting its depths, Henry noted that the deepest place on the pond corresponded with the human heart. And this is if a person were lying from one end to the other with their head up there and their arms outstretched. That little red spot right there is the deepest at 102 feet. Henry was off by about a foot with his own soundings, but incredibly accurate. And Henry would get his own survey equipment. And one of the things that he would do for money when he needed to work, because he only worked when he needed to, was contract surveying for the town of Concord. And there's dozens of contracts that are still at the library, special collections that show the work that he was doing for the town, for roads and farms and things. On a trip from his cabin into Concord in 1846 to get his shoes repaired, Henry runs into the local sheriff, who calls Henry out. Henry, you haven't paid your poll tax in the last few years. Henry is refusing to pay any money into a municipal system that tops off at the federal government, which supports slavery. Slavery is still an entity, and the Fugitive Slave Act, which is going to become more intense by 1850, makes all of us federal criminals if we assist a formerly enslaved person who comes into Concord in the Underground Railroad. And Henry says, I refuse to pay any money into this corrupt system, even at the town level, to the county level, or the state level, eventually to the federal level. Henry, I'll pay it for you. Don't you dare, he says. Don't you dare. This is in principle. Again, I refuse to pay this. Henry, I have to throw you in jail. Throw me in jail. So Henry spends his night in jail. And a great story that actually didn't happen, I'm going to tell you anyway, is that supposedly Ralph Waldo Emerson came and said, Henry, what are you doing in there? And he said, what are you doing out there? Actually didn't happen, but it's a great story. This experience will yield Henry's great essay, Civil Disobedience. This will influence Tolstoy, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., the anti-Vietnam War protesters, Eastern Bloc countries coming out from under the shadow of the USSR. A quote from it, how does it become a man to behave toward this American government today? I answer that he cannot without disgrace be associated with it. I cannot for an instant recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slave's government also. Henry left his cabin in September 1847 and tells us why in Walden. This is what you see today at the actual cabin site. I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there. Perhaps it seemed to me I had several more lives to live and could not spare any more time for that one. Again, it was an experiment. He's not doing it for the rest of his life. He's done with his 2-year, 2-month, and 2-day experiment. He is invited back immediately to the Emerson house, where he will stay for another extended stay while Ralph Waldo Emerson is traveling as a public speaker. And Henry really was a beloved sort of stepfather to the Emerson children and a platonic step-husband of sorts to Emerson's wife, Lydia. In 1849, oh, here's Lydia, I'm sorry, I forgot to pop the button there. In 1849, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers was published to lukewarm reviews, as the run of about 1,000 printings sold only a couple hundred. Henry was on the hook for the other 700 copies and had to bring them home to the upstairs of his family's house in his room, where he said, I have a library of 1,000 volumes, 700 of which I wrote myself. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 radicalized Thoreau more than any other event or legislation prior. And as I mentioned, it called for all Americans to return human property to their owners and made aiding or assisting them a federal crime. From Civil Disobedience, a quote from Henry, unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them? Or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? Are we obligated to break an immoral law? Not just wait wait for the legislature to change it, not wait and, just, so Henry's Henry's getting very quite radicalized in this, that moral suasion that came from the Garrisonians for the last 20 years hasn't worked. And now Henry is leaning more toward the fact that enslavement is a bloody atrocity, and it's only going to take a bloody atrocity to end it. There's going to be no legislating, no moral suasion to end slavery. And we will have Henry eventually be supporting John Brown with some of the other transcendentalists in Concord. In 1854, in Framingham, Thoreau gave his most impassioned anti-slavery speech. He's furious that his fellow Americans were busy blowing off fireworks and waving the flag in celebration of their quote unquote freedom while slavery continued. Thoreau noted, nowadays men wear a fool's cap and call it a liberty cap. I do not know, but there are some who, if they were tied to a whipping post and could get but one hand free, would use it to ring the bells and fire the cannons to celebrate their liberty. So some of my townsmen took the liberty to ring and fire. That was the extent of their freedom. And when the sound of the bells died away, their liberty died away also. While the powder was all expended, their liberty went off with the smoke. The law will never make men free. It is men who have got to make the law free. They are the lovers of law and order who observe the law when the government breaks it. Keep that in mind for 2025. In August of 1854, Walden or Life in the Woods was published. It fared better than a week on the Concord and Merrimack River week, selling 2,000 copies in a 5-year span. More on Walden in a minute. As I mentioned, Thoreau went on to support John Brown, as did Emerson. And Brown's plan to move beyond moral suasion, to confront slavery physically, basically to arm enslaved individuals and just have a bloody uprising to end slavery. And later, Henry would eulogize Brown in Concord and in lectures, traveling also after Brown's execution. Henry took a trip to Minnesota later in 1861 when tuberculosis really began to catch up with him. Henry's extensive notes and observations in his Indian notebooks are being poured over today by scholars. Bridgewater State Professor and Thoreau Society President John Cusick just published a comprehensive take on Thoreau's perception of and writings about Native Americans. This just came out last month. Henry returned to live with his family on Main Street in Concord and in the busy Thoreau household until his death in 1862 at 44. After his death, much of his work and his journals were published and brought to publication by the good work of his sister Sophia. As he lay dying, his Aunt Louisa asked him, "Henry, have you made peace with your God?" He replied, "I did not know we had ever quarreled." Two different people quote two different things that Henry said as his last words. In full consciousness, he joked, "Now comes good sailing." And two, in a little bit of out of consciousness, he said 2 words, moose, Indian. Ralph Waldo Emerson on Henry Thoreau after his death. The country knows not yet, or in the least part, how great a son it has lost. Emerson eulogized Henry. He chose to be rich by making his wants few and supplying them himself. There was somewhat military in his nature, not to be subdued, always manly and able, but rarely tender, as if he did not feel himself except in opposition. He was a speaker and actor of the truth, born such, and was ever running into dramatic situations from this cause, like his night in jail. No truer American existed than Thoreau. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson, a man who met Lincoln. I cannot help counting it a fault in him that he had no ambition. Wanting this instead of engineering for all America, he was the captain of a huckleberry party. Even Ralph Waldo Emerson didn't get Henry Thoreau. We are not all born to ambition. When Henry is asked by his class of 1837 if he's going to show up at the class reunion from Harvard, they have a little page that they send out. It says, "What's your occupation?" They give you a little line. And of course, from Harvard, you're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, a minister, a teacher. Henry writes, I'm a schoolmaster, a private tutor, a surveyor, a gardener, a farmer, a painter, a house painter, a carpenter, a mason, a day laborer, a pencil maker, a glass paper maker, that's a sandpaper maker, a writer, and sometimes a poetaster, an amateur poet. So he's this is Henry's profession. Now back to Walden. Thomas Starr King noted, rarely have we enjoyed a book more or been more grateful for many enriched suggestions. And as we shut the book up, we ask ourselves, will the great lesson it teaches of the freedom and beauty of a simple life be heeded? Will time ever come when it will be fashionable to be poor? That is, when men will be so smitten with a purpose to seek the true ends of life that they will not care about laying up riches on the earth. Who can say that it is impossible that such a time may come around, although the fashion of this world now runs with such a resistless current in the opposite direction? And in terms of more positive reviews and even coming into present day, John Updike noted, Walden aims at conversion, but this is true only insofar as we mean conversion of the mystic and personal order, introspective realization, not outward revolution, inward moral clarity at the level of the individual situated with the natural world, not a wholly minded movement en masse. The environmentalist, Bill McKibben, understanding the whole of this book is a hopeless task, McKibben said. Its writing resembles nothing so much as scripture. Ideas are condensed to epigrams, 4 or 5 to a paragraph. Its magic density yields dozens of different readings, psychological, spiritual, literary, political, cultural. I'd say those are the hallmarks of a masterpiece. The sheer volume of Thoreau's prose has paradoxically complicated the work of gaining a complete understanding of his personality, again, enigmatic. Invites selective quotation, tempting readers to pick and choose passages that support their pet theories about him. No doubt about that. Again, projection. Now we'll go back to some of the people in his time, picking on Henry a little bit more again. Mr. Thoreau seems to me to insist in the public on going back to flint and steel when there is a matchbox in his pocket, which he knows very well how to use in a pinch. Mr. Thoreau had not a healthy mind, or he would not have been so fond of prescribing. His whole life was a search for the doctor. Thoreau had no humor, and this implies that he was a sorry logician. I once had a glimpse of a genuine solitary who spent his winters 150 miles beyond all human communication, and there dwelt with his rifle as his only confidant. Compared with this, the shanty on Walden Pond has something, the air, it must be confessed, of a hermitage of a la chevrette. This is a thin goat skin. So again, why isn't Henry playing at Survivor? Being called out by James Russell Lowell for something he never said he was going to do. 2015, Catherine Schultz in the New Yorker. The hypocrisy is not that Thoreau aspired to solitude and self-sufficiency, but kept going home for cookies and company and laundry. That's just the gap between aspiration and execution, plus the variability in our needs and moods from one moment to the next, eminently human experiences, which, had Thoreau engaged with them, would have made for a far more interesting and useful book. The hypocrisy is that Thoreau lived a complicated life, but pretended to live a simple one. Worse, he preached at others to live as he did not, while berating them for their own compromises and complexities. I really don't know if Catherine Schultz actually read all of Walden, or maybe just the Cliff Notes. One, Henry did not live a complicated life. Ralph Waldo Emerson just told you he kept his wants few, and he lived in the attic space of his parents' busy house, and kept things to an absolute minimum. Now, I don't think she read this book in full, because what the rest of Walden is a book about his needs and moods from one moment to the next, which she thinks would have made a much more useful book. And that's completely what Walden is about, Henry's meditations, inspirations, observations, etc. And I know she didn't read this book because she didn't get past the frontispiece in the book here, because he did not aspire to solitude and self-sufficiency. He wrote, "I do not propose to write an ode to dejection, but to brag as lustily as Chanticleer in the morning, standing on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors up." He is not cowering into his cabin on Walden, Henry. I take people from around the world on tours of Concord, and they come in and say, "Well, Henry was a hypocrite. Didn't he really didn't do what he said he was going to do." This is why I'm here tonight, to talk about this. This is just this past summer. Bill Cole, the Boston Globe. His whole experiment was a little contrived. We all have this feeling and belief that he was communing with nature in complete solitude when basically his mother was bringing him lunch and doing his laundry. I love this. We all have this feeling and belief. I don't. There's no reason to. I don't know who came up with this. Too many people watch Survivor TV. That's all it is. It's television. Get your head out of the tube and read one of America's greatest works. And basically, I like this word. You know what basically means? I read the Cliff Notes. Basically, this book is this. This is one of the hardest books to read. There's so much to this book. A lot of people don't even get through the first chapter of economy. Let's see. I'll end with it is the greatest of all advantages to enjoy no advantage at all. I find it invariably true. The poorer I am, the richer I am. What you consider my disadvantage, I consider my advantage. I have never gotten over my surprise that I've been born into the most estimable place in all the world in the very nick of time, too. Thanks for coming out tonight. Nick of time, on a minute before 8. Yes.
I will never forget when my son, who's now 53, came home and had read Civil Disobedience. He took that to heart, and he was very happy to hear about it, and we got to hear about it a lot. So that brought back a memory.
Yeah. In the Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King had civil disobedience with him. Yeah. And when you read
He
MLK's
needed
right,
it too.
he was quite inspired by it as well.
Did he have an editor at any point? Like, I feel like Walden is so complex that people can't digest it. And that's where all these misconceptions come from, because they're just picking pieces.
Yeah. I don't know if James Fields, who is Emerson's editor, is the one who publishes Walden. I'd have to double check. This old paperback I had talks about that. It probably doesn't. This is some other ownership at this point.
I just feel like today it would be broken into multiple works.
Yeah. Economy is really difficult. And it's long, and it's paining to read because Henry is obsessing on every penny and every half penny. And he tells you about building his cabin for $26. You know, Emerson's just bought his house for $3,500 across town. And Henry's bragging that, you know, he's spent so little, he's recouped some of the wood from some of the Irish shanties of the railroad workers. You know, he writes things like, "I bought these nails for 7 cents. I really should have only paid 4 because they weren't worth 7. You know, and he's just twisted up. And I remember as a 16-year-old reading this in high school going, my God, you know, then you realize Henry's holding a mirror up to us. He's being obnoxious about money because we're obnoxious about money. And so I think it's really, you know, by the second page of this book, he laments people who are born to property, saying, oh, they just start digging their grave. They have to maintain all this property. They've got animals, they've got land, they've got buildings, all this kind of thing, like all this material stuff. he's diametric, as opposed to, wow, that's wonderful to be born with all this, that you own all this property. And Henry says, this is around your neck, that you're going to spend a lot of your life and time were key elements that Henry's really obsessed about, having to take care of all that. He says, those things are a lot easier being born into than having gotten rid of. Henry does have one afternoon where he actually buys a farm down toward 9 Acre Corner, and he buys it from a farmer, an overgrown farm, and he's an elderly man with his wife, and the man comes back to Henry's house and says, my wife says she doesn't want to sell the farm. And so Henry never owns property. He almost did. He did for an afternoon, and I think he was kind of relieved that he didn't have to take that on. But it sort of, he felt like it was the thing that he was supposed to do. Yeah, Henry's friends say to him, hey, come on up to Portland. The train now runs up to Portland. He's like, well, I got to work, a whole day in order to get the fare to get up there and back, or I could start walking. And I could go up, I'd be up there in a few days. But if I start walking from here to Portland, and maybe I'll meet, numerous people and have interesting experiences and learn a bunch of other things along the way. And with time at a premium, at his luxury, he doesn't have to worry about going to a particular job. He doesn't have any debt. He hasn't bitten off anything he has to pay for. So he's thinking about, like, maybe I'll just walk to Portland,
Have you heard about Roland Wells Robbins?
Yeah, who found the site?
Found the site.
Yeah.
I heard him give a lecture back in the 70s about finding that site.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
So Thoreau was aware that Walden was a success before he died. I mean, certainly compared to, he became a little bit of a celebrity. How did he react to that?
I don't think he considered it. He had some fan mail, and someone said, I really want to come and visit you and meet you in person. And he wrote things back like, oh, I'm really shabby and, disheveled, and, you don't run me. All my good stuff is in my books. Just read my books. He's very, he did public lecture 75 times, Henry, and, to really polar opposites in terms of reviews and that kind of thing. I don't think that, other than his close circle of friends that came and saw him, because he had a long arc into his death from tuberculosis in the front parlor of that house on Main Street in Concord. And Channing, Ricketts, his friends came and hung out with him. But other than that, he was considered kind of a character and wasn't really in the literary. He was early on invited into the literary circles of Emerson, but he and Emerson sort of part, especially when Henry didn't pay his poll tax. Emerson was actually quite upset about that. Emerson was very much like society and solitude had to be balanced, and that, in order for society to work, you had to sort of work with things, this kind of thing. And Henry starts moving away. And so they kind of cool off, Walden and Henry. But early on, he was the lurker in those transcendentalist, talks and meetings with Alcott and Emerson and his friends. And he was always just that judge that they called him as a kid, always had something to throw in there that was sort of contrarian. When a young man came to Emerson's house and said, I'm at Harvard. And Emerson said, oh, I understand they teach all the branches there. And Henry's in the corner and goes, yes, but none of the roots. It's kind of, he's cantankerous. So he's certainly not, I think he was moderately successful in his time with Walden, but I don't think it goes to his head in any way. As I said, he's upstairs and he's got his cats, and his 700 books a week, and upstairs in his attic room with his busy family down underneath him. And I don't really see any like, well, okay, I've made it kind of thing that he ever steps out, says, okay, now I'm going to go buy my farm, or now I'm going to do this with this money that I made. I think it's I think it really builds after his death, and it's really his sister Sophia and her work to get the rest of his work out, including civil disobedience and that kind of thing after his death. 1866 that comes out. That really puts him on the map. And Emerson's eulogy and that kind of thing. So at 44, must have been tough. It's 1862. You're in the middle of the Civil War. And you don't get to see how
Do we
that
know
turns
what
out.
he died from?
Tuberculosis.
Oh,
And the scourge of the era. Everybody had tuberculosis at some level. And it either killed you in 8 months or you could live for 60 years with it and it would kill you down the road. But and he was in incredibly good shape and always out and healthy and bathing in Walden Pond, all that kind of thing. But it caught up with him by 61.
Any more?
Two thoughts. One is, you probably know, Nat Philbrick talks about reading Moby Dick every year. I wonder if you.
Who did? I'm sorry, I missed the beginning.
Nathaniel Philbrick.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And as you said, Walden is quite complex. And I wonder if you or other people you know of read it over and over and over and discover new things. And the other question is, well, it's technical. You said his voyage on the Concord and Merrimack, that he went down and then sailed back. Did he come back upstream? He and his brother?
Yeah, they came up upstream. Yep.
That would be a lot tougher than going down.
Yeah. They had a sail and they made it into a camper at night. They made it into yep, they went up and parked it and then they climbed up a couple of mountains in New Hampshire
Mhm.
And then came back down. I sometimes will listen to Walden on a long drive in certain sections of it. It's kind of interesting to hear how it kind of hits you in kind of this older style. And you have to kind of get attuned to it as opposed to while you're reading it. I haven't read it in full in a couple of years, but I've listened to chunks of it on some drives. And yeah, there's always something that jumps out at you. And you kind of go back and then you dig and that you missed. It just washed right over you the first time. There's a lot of that, as Bill McKibben said, paragraphs are stacked.
Yeah.
He did a lot of editing. You're asking about editing. He did a ton of re-editing, to Walden. And his journals, the manuscript itself, there's just incredible amounts of cross outs and whole paragraphs gone and this kind of thing. I know a guy in Quincy who has a manuscript edition that has one page from Walden, which is in the early 20th century, a huge voluminous kind of an encyclopedic thing of Henry's writing. And at the time, they actually cut a piece of the manuscript and included it in the first book of the series.
Wow.
And you would get anything that Henry published. So it could be from a week, could have been from any of his other wild fruits and other pieces. But this happened to be the second to last page of Walden. And it's got whole paragraphs just X'd out and circles in it and like move it over here and this kind of stuff. And so he did a lot of work on it. Absolutely. Thanks again for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you.